Moving On. Written by R5H. Narrated by Sage Wild. With Brian as Arthur Kingsman, David does voices as Lewis Pepper, and Sage Wild as Vivi Yukino. This fanfiction reading contains graphic depictions of violence and horror. Viewer discretion is advised. Prelude 1. Pompeii. Mystery howled along as Lewis sang. Not that the dog knew the words, what with being a dog and all, but he did have a thing for tunes. Lewis continued in a rich baritone, slapping the wheel with every long beat.
Lewis, you're a goddamn sellout,
Arthur said, slumping over the back of the van's front seat between Vivi and Mystery.
Uh-oh, Bastille's getting popular. Better listen to the one song.
He still wasn't quite sure how he'd been placed in the back instead of the dog.
Oh, come on, Snooty,
Vivi said, bobbing her head to the beat as the song sped up a bit.
Live a little!
She and Lewis harmonized together on these words, octaves apart, and Mystery howled again in approval. Arthur sighed. At least they'd taken his remark as a joke, which he was pretty sure was how he'd meant it. Though maybe he'd have smiled more if he were trying to be funny. He didn't know. All he was really sure about was that he was watching his two best friends singing together in the front seat, and he felt left out for more reasons than just not knowing the words. The backseat situation probably had something to do with that.
Left here,
Vivi said, cutting herself off mid-song.
The cave's like a mile and a half down this road.
Lewis obeyed, turning the wheel with one hand. With the other, he held an imaginary bow and played air violin. Arthur managed to smile at that. Lewis was the only person he'd ever seen who mimed a classical instrument.
Smack,
said one thought as Lewis and Vivi.
Smack them in the back of their stupid heads.
He ignored the thought. An intrusive thought, that was what it was called, according to Lewis. One of the benefits of having a psych major for a best bud was that long-standing neuroses could get real-world explanations.
Tons of people have them, amigo,
Lewis had said when Arthur had confided in him about it.
Like, say you see a cliff and think, what would it feel like if I jumped off the cliff? Doesn't matter. You're not your thoughts. You're your actions.
By that logic,
Arthur thought, feeling the back of the seat dig into his chest.
I'm a slightly nervous wreck who is incredibly okay with becoming a third wheel, to friends with awful musical taste.
The refrain came back around again, and he knew the words to this bit at least.
But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing's changed at all? And if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like you've been here before?
He mumbled as Lewis and Vivi belted it out. He skipped the lines about being an optimist, giving Mystery a few scratches on the head. For some reason, Mystery didn't lean back into the scratches like he usually did. Instead, he stared at Arthur through those tiny spectacles Vivi always had him wear. Like Arthur had done something wrong. Arthur stared back, unnerved. For God's sake, how could Mystery unnerve him of all things? He was about to go into a spooky cave known for creepy spirit hauntings, and Mystery was the fluffy pooch he'd known for more than a year. One of the two of these things should have been disquieting, and it shouldn't have been the pooch.
Ah, screw it,
Arthur thought as the song ended. They pulled up to the mouth of the cave. A worryingly literal mouth, in fact. The stalactites hanging from the ceiling of the entrance looked like teeth and, yep, of course. Arthur looked up to see two eye-shaped holes in the appropriate positions. An unnatural green glow shining through them. He gulped.
Let's just see what the big deal is about this place and get out.
2 paths.
Lewis muttered, holding a torch.
Of course he is,
Arthur thought. One had to adhere to certain genre requirements in the spooky green cave.
Never mind that, we actually have a flashlight. No, No, big strongman Lewis has to set something on fire.
You think the Wraith of Westbrook likes the high or the low?
The Wraith of Westbrook?
Arthur repeated, looking at the sign that, of course, had an actual skull on it.
If it hadn't been somewhere starting with a W, you think they would have called that a Wraith?
He shivered and rubbed his arm, feeling a sudden chill. Vivi laughed.
How many years have you been doing ghost stuff, Arthur? If it doesn't alliterate or rhyme or something, then what's the point?
She tapped her chin a few times.
All right, I'll take the low road with our favorite candy little canine.
She kneeled down and scratched his head. At this time, he responded in a normal dog-like way, growling a bit in satisfaction and closing his eyes.
Lewis, Arthur, you take the high road.
Got it.
Lewis said, motioning Arthur toward the path that went upwards.
See you on the other side, Vivi.
Same.
She said, smiling at him as she went down the other path. Mystery followed, but not without giving Arthur another suspicious look. He shivered again and followed Lewis, who held his torch out ahead of him like a regular Indiana Jones.
Grab the torch,
Said a thought.
and shove it in his friggin' poofy purple hair.
He actually had to stop and shake his head for this one.
No!
The real him thought back.
That's horrible! And it's called a pompadour.
How are you doing, Arthur?
Lewis asked, just ahead of him.
If things get hairy, just stay behind me. I'll protect you.
Thanks, Prince Charming.
Arthur muttered, looking anywhere but at his friend.
But your Rapunzel's downstairs.
Lewis looked back at him, one eyebrow raised.
We're in a spooky cave because we think there might be an evil ghost in here, Arthur. I'm being sincere. What was that about Rapunzel?
And I am being appreciative. Look at my appreciative face.
Arthur did not change his frowning expression or his flat tone of voice.
Now that's below your normal bantered standard, Hermano. Is something eating you, or... Never mind.
Lewis said, sighing and turning back and walking onward.
And Rapunzel is a whole other fairy tale you should know.
Punch him in his stupid face.
Arthur stared at the thought.
That's not something I want to do. Shut up, brain.
He kept close behind Lewis as they continued, and eventually they emerged onto a balcony-like outcropping. Below them was a forest of jet-black stalagmites in a sea of green mist, flowing like the river Styx came to mind. The emerald light of the mist iridesced off the stalagmites, revealing alarmingly sharp points at their tops.
Whoa,
Lewis said, leaning forward, his chest slightly over the edge.
that is gorgeous, that is.
Push him.
Arthur turned away, gripping his arm for some reason.
Stop it.
He whispered, squeezing his eyes shut.
Just stop it.
When he opened his eyes again, a patch of white fur was in his peripheral vision, and he looked down to see Mystery staring up at him.
What the hell are you doing up here, Mystery?
He asked, squinting as the dog's gaze failed to move.
Push him.
The dog cocked his head to the side as Arthur smacked himself in the head, trying to get the thought under control. It was never this bad.
Push him. Push him, Arthur. Push him.
His legs were moving. Oh God, why were his legs moving?
Push him, Arthur. And then go for the day next.
He tried to stop them, but it didn't seem like they were his anymore. He looked at Lewis, a scream rising in his throat, but unable to escape.
Push him, Arthur.
His legs were moving, and his arm was rising. And instead of his own arm, he saw green skin on his hand. Half of his mouth was contorting into a rictus, and he realized with a new thrill of terror, he didn't call himself Arthur inside his own head.
That's right, Arthur. You don't. But I do. Push him now.
Hey, Arthur, are you seeing this?
Lewis asked, turning to look at him. The smile on Arthur's face widened to know that Lewis would be able to see. Then, Arthur's green hand was at his chest, pushing him forward. It didn't take much. He was so close to the edge. And Lewis went tumbling down. Arthur saw a moment of fear in his friend's eyes before they disappeared over the edge.
No!
Arthur said, but it came out as a strangled gurgle, drowned out by Lewis's own screech of terror.
Yes, Arthur.
He only had half of his throat, and he was losing that half quickly. He heard a thunk, and Lewis's screams stopped like a switch had been flipped.
Well done. Want to see your good work?
His legs stepped forward toward the precipice. Pain. He didn't even have a frame of reference to comprehend. Pain so intense it wrapped around the scale and came out as dim confusion. His chest tightened with the mounting dread of the realization to come. He fell to his knees, less than a yard from the edge, gasping in shock. From his vantage point, he saw a twitching hand reaching up from the stalagmites covered in blood. He let out another strangled sound and turned on his knees, using his arms to push. But he fell over. Something was missing. As he collapsed, he looked away from the ledge and saw something that looked like it belonged in a fever dream. It was bigger than Arthur, bigger than Lewis, bigger than their whole van, and black with a red glow about it and its 6 tails. And in its mouth was a green arm, struggling against the creature's grip. As Arthur continued to collapse, he conceded that the arm had to be his. The pain hit him full force, and he didn't have enough air left in his lungs to let it out, or to do anything else. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was a pair of yellow spectacles on the creature's snout. There was a graveyard. And someone who shouldn't have been there was. There was a funeral. And someone who should have been there wasn't. Now, no one is left but Arthur. And a body buried beneath a headstone that read Luis Hernandez, with dates of birth and death. And Arthur didn't know where to begin. Standing in front of the headstone, he gazed up at the sky, which was the kind of dark gray that funerals deserved, and looked for thoughts. He gave it a try and said,
Hey, Lewis?
But there didn't seem to be any future in that conversation starter, so he gave up on it. Arthur shivered as the wind blew around him on the cold fall day, and he stared numbly at the stone.
What do you say at the grave of your best friend?
No answer there.
What do you say at the grave of your victim?
Reflexively grabbed his shoulder. The one that didn't have an arm on it anymore. He had plans to build a mechanical replacement, but for the funeral he had to settle for this clumsy prosthetic. Actually, calling it a prosthetic was being too kind. The elbow didn't move and the fingers didn't bend. It was just a piece of plastic, one that looked human when disguised by a suit. Anyway, he had to say something. And there wasn't anyone else he could say it to. Vivi was amnesiac. Mystery was terrifying. And no one else would have believed a possession tale for even a moment. Lewis was the only one he could talk to. And Lewis was dead. Arthur sat down on the grass, which the chill had turned stiff and unpleasant. The points poked into his suit pants. His fake arm splayed out at an awkward angle to accommodate him.
It was a nice ceremony, I think.
Well, that seemed a better way to start.
I mean, I don't have a lot of comparisons, thank God. But it was really moving. The priest gave a really beautiful sermon about how you're in a better place now. He is open, buddy.
He hesitated and looked around for a moment. But it was just him and some headstones within hearing range. The closest sign of life was his van on the cemetery's driveway where Mystery was napping. Well, unless the not-a-dog was watching him through the windows with that stare of his. Arthur looked back at the tombstone.
And then we all sang a couple of hymns. And I think most of the people there cried. Everyone that made it anyway. Vivi,
Arthur looked back at the gravestone. He ran his good hand up through his hair, as he often did when he was stressed, making it stick up. His hair always stuck up.
Vivi couldn't come. Sorry. She had a thing.
He'd lied to Vivi. He'd lied to his family. He'd lied to everyone else. Not to Lewis. Arthur hung his head and said,
She doesn't remember you, Lewis, at all.
That had been the worst part of it. He'd woken up with no arm in a hospital bed after the cave, half expecting to see green flesh on his body or some sort of hellhound in front of him. So it had been a relief to see Vivi at his bedside. At first. Until he'd noticed that she didn't seem to be putting on a brave face at all. But that she was simply relieved to see he was okay. Until she'd asked him who this Lewis person was that he kept muttering about in his sleep, and he'd nearly gagged on his own tongue at the enormity of the question that hit him. Honestly, it was better that she hadn't gone to the funeral. He'd been on the edge of his seat the whole time, clutching the railing and shaking like an invalid with his cane, fighting the urge to stand up and scream. Whether it would have been a confession or just an unintelligible cry, he had no idea. But he'd made it through. Barely. If Vivi had been there. Vivi, the blithe spirit, who should have been crying her eyes out. If Vivi had been there...
She came to the wake with me, just because I seemed sad, you know?
Arthur continued. He was talking faster now, perversely glad of the chance to say it to someone.
Just kept smiling the whole time. And your Aunt Mabel tried to tell her how sorry she was for Vivi's loss. And Vivi just stared through her, like her eyes turned to glass or something. Like how she just tunes me out when I try to bring anything about you or what happened. Like I'm a ghost.
Something between a laugh and a sob escaped his throat, like he was the one who'd gotten the raw deal in this.
Bash your head in.
Suggested a thought, and he had an image of himself grabbing the headstone with his good hand and pulling his body forward as he swung his skull into the corner of the stone again and again and again and again.
Stop! Stop!
He sobbed, squeezing his fingers into a fist and pushing them against the ground, putting his weight into them.
I didn't. I swear. I never would have done it, Lewis. I never would have pushed you. There's something happened, and I couldn't control it. And I'm so sorry.
His eyes squeezed shut against tears that would have blinded him anyway.
Something got me, and it made me think of Vivi like I could. I don't know. But that's never gonna happen. I'm not gonna start dating her or something just because you're
Out of my way.
gone!
Arthur screamed, forcing back those 4 poisonous words.
Lewis is gone! Stop it! I'm not like that. I'm not like that. I'm not.
He panted, like he'd just climbed a cliff. Arthur wiped his eyes against his arm, not letting his fist up off the ground. Then, looked up without opening his eyes. Where the grave was, in his mind's eye he saw Lewis towering above him, his face unreadable in shadow. That was all right. Lewis wouldn't have cared what he thought. Actions spoke louder than apologies, and it didn't matter anyway. He opened his eyes, and the only Lewis in front of him was beneath a stone bearing his name. Arthur tried to stand, pushing off the ground with both hands, but he only had one now. He lost his balance and fell into the grass, feeling pinpricks against his skin. With a grunt of pain, he tried again, slower this time, like an old man.
I need a prosthetic.
He thought.
A real one, not a mannequin arm.
Can't be useless forever.
He was fully vertical now, and gave the headstone a last look.
I love her.
he said in a voice heavy with tears.
Because she's my only best friend I have left. And I'm gonna be stronger next time, I swear. I'm gonna protect us now. It'll never happen again. And she's gonna be happy. Even if she doesn't remember anything, and I can't say anything. That's what you'd want, right?
He half turned away, but stopped for his final words.
Thanks for listening, Lewis.
He said over his shoulder.
Goodbye.
Then, he was half limping back to the van, feeling the weight of the prosthetic on his shoulder and the tears on his cheek. Arthur didn't start driving as soon as he got into the car. It wouldn't have been safe. So, he let his head rest against the steering wheel like a pillow after a long day. And it had been a long day. He heard a keening noise, and a white snout burrowed its way into his lap. When he realized what it was, he jumped in fright.
Gah!
Mystery retreated to the other end of the front seat, looking at him like a normal dog would at their sad human. Arthur couldn't resist literal puppy dog eyes for long. He reached his hand across. He'd have used a 10-foot pole if he'd had one, but he settled for keeping his body as far away from his hand as possible, and scratched Mystery's head. The dog reacted appropriately, leaning up into the scritches as Arthur moved his hand down to rub his snout, a favorite of Mystery's.
Alright,
Arthur sighed.
come here.
If there was a way to morosely leap, Mystery did it, quickly flopping his head and front paws onto Arthur's lap as Arthur continued to pet him. Arthur's ragged breathing became more regular. There was something about having a dog, even a pretend one, that could really calm a person.
You got a thing out of me, didn't you?
Arthur said, looking down at Mystery.
Bit late, but it was gonna take me over all the way and you stopped it. So, I guess you're on my side?
Mystery looked up and woofed softly, but without a trace of comprehension on his face. It was just how a dog reacted to his human talking. That was all right. If Mystery could pretend to be a dog, Arthur could pretend that nothing was wrong too. Maybe that was what Vivi needed. Someone to match her optimism. He took his good hand off of Mystery's back and turned on the ignition, rebelling internally at how wrong it felt to be the one in the driver's seat, when he was so used to just being the one who fixed the van.
Having only one arm probably doesn't help with that either,
he thought, pulling out of the cemetery as the day darkened. But he'd get a nice working arm, and with a little practice, he would make it look like he'd always been the one driving. That was Moving On by R5H. If you're curious about this fanfiction, support the original author on Tumblr. Also, don't forget to support the creator of Mystery Skulls Animated by watching the music videos on YouTube. Links are in the description below. Thank you for listening.